The envelope arrived on a Thursday in March, watermarked with salt and smelling faintly of diesel fuel. Eleanor Hartwell held it to the kitchen window, watching dust motes spiral through the afternoon light, and noticed three things that made her stomach tighten. The postmark was illegible, blurred as if someone had tried to erase it. The paper felt thicker than military-issue stationery, almost like parchment. And when she tilted it, a fine residue of sand or ash scattered across her fingers, leaving tiny gray smudges that wouldn't brush away. She opened it with her mother's letter opener, the one with the ivory handle, and read the first line twice before understanding that the handwriting wasn't quite right. The loops were Thomas, the slant was Thomas's, but the pressure of the pen was all wrong, too light, as if whoever wrote it was barely touching the page. The letter said he was coming home, but Thomas had been declared missing in action 4 months ago. Was she reading a message from her husband, or had someone else learned to write in a dead man's hand? Chapter 1. The Promise Made in Autumn. Eleanor Hartwell had married Thomas on October 12, 1941, exactly 53 days before the world changed. The ceremony took place in the First Methodist Church on Maple Street, where her grandmother had been married and where her mother still arranged flowers every Sunday. Eleanor wore a dress with pearl buttons down the back, 42 of them, which her sister Judith had counted while fastening them one by one. The reception lasted 3 hours. Thomas had smiled the entire time, that easy smile that had first caught her attention at the county fair 2 summers before, when he'd won her a stuffed elephant by knocking down milk bottles with a baseball. They'd honeymooned for 4 days at a cabin near Lake Michigan, where the water was already cold and the trees had turned the color of fire. Then December came, and with it the radio announcements that turned every living room into a war room. Thomas enlisted on December 10, 1941, standing in line at the recruitment office for 6 hours with 200 other men from the county. He came home that evening with papers that smelled like carbon copies and told Eleanor he'd be shipping out within 8 weeks. She'd been kneading bread dough when he said it, and her hands had frozen in the bowl, flour coating her fingers like a second skin. He'd promised her 3 things that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the radio playing swing music in the background. He would write every week, he would keep his head down, and he would come home to build the house they'd drawn plans for on napkins during their honeymoon. You'll keep those promises? She'd asked, searching his face for certainty. Every single one, he'd replied, taking her flour-dusted hand in his. That was the last promise she could verify he'd kept. Chapter 2. The Mathematics of Separation. The United States military postal system during World War II processed approximately 38 million pieces of mail per week at its peak in 1944. Letters from servicemen traveled an average of 12,000 miles and took between 2 to 6 weeks to reach their destinations, passing through sorting facilities in New York, London, Casablanca, and dozens of staging points in between. The Office of Censorship employed over 14,000 civilians to read and redact sensitive information, removing unit locations, battle plans, and casualty figures with black ink and razor blades. Of the estimated 6 billion V-mail letters sent during the war, approximately 3% were lost to enemy action, weather, or simple human error, failure rate of roughly 180 million pieces of correspondence that vanished into the gaps between continents. For Eleanor Hartwell, these statistics translated into a ritual. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she walked 4 blocks to the post office on 3rd Street and asked Mrs. Patterson behind the counter if anything had arrived from overseas. For the first 6 months, the answer was almost always yes. Thomas wrote about the food, terrible, the weather, worse, and the men in his unit with a careful lightness that never quite concealed the weight underneath. He sent her a pressed flower from somewhere in England he couldn't say where, and a photograph of himself standing next to a jeep, grinning despite the mud on his uniform. He told her about a Frenchman who played accordion in the evenings and a kid from Kansas who carried his mother's Bible in his breast pocket. He never mentioned combat directly, but Eleanor learned to read between the lines, to understand that "we moved positions last week" meant they'd been under fire, and "lost some good men" meant he'd held someone's hand while they died. The last letter arrived on September 3, 1944. It was shorter than usual, just a single page, and Thomas's handwriting looked rushed, the letters cramped together as if he'd been writing in dim light or with little time. He told her about a town they'd liberated again, no name, and how the children had thrown flowers at their trucks. He mentioned being tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhausted that sleep couldn't fix. And then, at the bottom of the page, He'd written something that she would return to again and again in the months that followed. If something happens, Ellie, don't stop believing I'm trying to get home. No matter what anyone says, I'll find a way back to you. After that, silence. Chapter 3. When the telegram came, the Western Union boy was 16 years old and wore a uniform that looked 2 sizes too large. He arrived on January 11, 1945, at 3:47 in the afternoon, just as Eleanor was taking a pie from the oven. She saw him through the kitchen window, walking up the front path with his shoulders hunched against the cold, and she knew before he knocked what he was carrying. Everyone knew what it meant when the telegram boy came to your door. She'd watched him visit the Morrison house 2 months earlier, and the Kowalski place before that. Now it was her turn. She opened the door before he could knock. The boy, his name was Billy Marsh. She would learn later, handed her the yellow envelope with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm real sorry." Eleanor took the telegram and stood in the doorway, holding it without opening it, feeling the winter air pour into the house. Billy shifted his weight from foot to foot, uncertain whether he should stay or go. Finally, she looked at him and said, "Would you like some pie?" "It's apple." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm, too distant. "No, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I have to." He gestured vaguely toward his bicycle leaning against the fence, then fled down the path as if the house itself might burn him. Eleanor closed the door and sat at the kitchen table. She placed the telegram on the checkered tablecloth, next to the sugar bowl and the vase of dried flowers Thomas had sent her from England. The envelope wasn't sealed. Western Union left them open so recipients would not have to suffer the additional cruelty of breaking the seal to read the worst news of their lives. The message was typed in capital letters. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Private Thomas J. Hartwell, has been reported missing in action since 20 December in France. If further details or other information are received, you will be promptly notified." She read it 3 times, trying to make the words mean something other than what they said. Missing. Not killed. Missing. There was a difference, wasn't there? Missing meant he could still be out there, injured perhaps, or captured, or simply separated from his unit. Missing meant possibility. Missing meant hope. She folded the telegram carefully and placed it in the drawer with Thomas's letters. All 37 of them, arranged chronologically, and tied with the blue ribbon he'd given her on their wedding day. Then she went back to the kitchen and finished making dinner, setting 2 places at the table the way she always had. Chapter 4. The Theology of Waiting. Eleanor's mother had been a practical woman who believed in God the way she believed in weather, as a force to be acknowledged but not necessarily understood. Eleanor herself had attended church regularly, but without particular fervor, finding comfort in the ritual more than the doctrine. But after the telegram came, she discovered something inside herself that she hadn't known existed. A desperate, clawing need to believe that prayer could reach across an ocean and pull her husband back from whatever darkness had swallowed him. She began attending morning services at the First Methodist Church, arriving before dawn to sit in the empty sanctuary and whisper Thomas's name into the cold air. Reverend Michaels, a kindly man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a limp from the First War, found her there one morning in late January. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said softly, "you don't need to come so early. God hears prayers at any hour." "I know," Eleanor replied, her hands folded in her lap. "But I need to say them when it's quiet. When there's no one else asking for things." The Reverend sat down in the pew beside her. "You're praying for Thomas. Every day. Multiple times a day. That's good. Prayer is a comfort." Eleanor turned to look at him. "I'm not praying for comfort, Reverend. I'm praying for a miracle. I'm praying that wherever he is, whatever happened to him, he'll find his way back." Reverend Michaels was quiet for a moment. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Eleanor. But we must also prepare ourselves for his will, whatever that may be." "His will?" Eleanor's voice carried an edge she hadn't intended. "What if his will is wrong? What if I need to pray harder, longer, louder? What if the only thing standing between Thomas coming home and Thomas dying in some foreign field is whether I believe hard enough?" The Reverend placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Faith isn't about bargaining with God, my dear. It's about trust." But Eleanor had stopped listening. She'd made up her mind. She would pray with the intensity of someone trying to hold a door open through sheer force of will, and she would not stop until she had proof, one way or another, of what had happened to her husband. The women's prayer circle met every Tuesday evening in the church basement. Eleanor joined them in February, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with 11 other women who had husbands, sons, or brothers overseas. They prayed together, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Margaret Donnelly prayed for her son in the Pacific. Ruth Kimball prayed for her husband in Italy. Catherine Price prayed for her brother, whose plane had been shot down over Germany. And Eleanor prayed for Thomas to send her a sign. "Please," she whispered, her eyes closed, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Just let me know he's alive. A letter, a message, anything. Show me he's still out there." 6 weeks later, the first strange letter arrived. Chapter 5. The Letter from Nowhere. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately, those familiar loops and curves that she'd memorized from 36 previous letters. But something was wrong. The envelope bore no return address, only her name and street written in Thomas's hand. The postmark was smudged beyond recognition, and the paper itself felt wrong, thicker than military stationery with an almost waxy texture. When she opened it, a fine powder gray, like ash or very fine sand dusted her kitchen table. She unfolded the letter carefully. "My dearest Ellie, I know you must have received the telegram by now. I know what it said, and I know what you must think. But I'm writing to tell you that I'm still here. I'm not where I was, and I'm not where I should be, but I'm somewhere and I'm trying to get home. Don't stop praying for me. I can hear you. When you speak my name in the church, I hear it like a bell ringing across a great distance. It's the only thing that keeps me oriented, the only thing that tells me which direction home is. I can't explain where I am or what happened. They won't let me say much. But know that I'm fighting to get back to you every single day. Keep the light on for me, Ellie. Keep saying my name. All my love." Thomas. Eleanor read the letter 4 times, her hands shaking. The rational part of her mind, the part that balanced checkbooks and canned vegetables and kept the house running, insisted that this was either a cruel prank or a case of mistaken identity. But the handwriting was his. The way he signed his name, with that characteristic flourish on the T, was unmistakably his. And the nickname Ellie was something only he called her, a private name that existed only between the two of them. She turned the letter over, searching for clues. On the back, in much smaller writing, almost as an afterthought, were 3 words: "Don't stop believing." That evening, Eleanor returned to the church. She found Reverend Michaels in his office, reviewing Sunday's sermon. "I received a letter," she told him, standing in his doorway. "From Thomas." The Reverend looked up, his expression a mixture of hope and concern. "That's wonderful news, Eleanor. When did he write it?" "That's just it, I don't know. There's no date. And the military said he was missing 4 months ago." She handed him the letter. Reverend Michaels read it slowly, his brow furrowing. When he finished, he set it down on his desk and removed his glasses, cleaning them with a handkerchief. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I don't want to give you false hope, but I also don't want to dismiss what you're experiencing. Sometimes in times of great stress and grief, we can— You think I'm imagining this?" Eleanor's voice was sharp. "I think you want very badly for your husband to be alive, and that's completely understandable. But this letter, it's unusual. The things he writes about hearing your prayers across a distance, not being able to explain where he is, these are the kinds of things that appear in our dreams and our wishes. The handwriting is his. Handwriting can be imitated. By whom? Who would do that?" Reverend Michaels spread his hands helplessly. "I don't know. Perhaps someone who knew Thomas, someone trying to offer comfort in a misguided way? Or perhaps—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps this is a message from Thomas, but not in the way you think. Perhaps it's a spiritual communication, a message from the other side." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. "You think he's dead? I think we have to consider all possibilities." Eleanor took the letter back, folding it carefully. "Thank you for your time, Reverend." Her voice was formal now, distant. "Eleanor, please." But she was already walking away, the letter pressed against her heart. Chapter 6. The Rationalist's Argument. Eleanor's sister Judith arrived from Chicago 3 days later, having taken emergency leave from her job at the telephone company. Judith was 2 years younger than Eleanor, but had always acted like the elder sibling, practical and level-headed to a fault. She listened to Eleanor's story while unpacking her suitcase in the guest room, her face carefully neutral. "Let me see the letter," she said when Eleanor finished. Eleanor retrieved it from her knitstand drawer, where she'd been keeping it next to her bed. Judith examined it with the methodical attention of someone inspecting a suspicious document. "The paper's strange," Judith observed. Where would Thomas get paper like this? I don't know. Maybe from a local shop in France? Maybe supplies were low? Maybe… Judith held the letter up to the window, squinting at it. There's no date, no location, no unit designation. Just my dearest Ellie and a lot of vague statements about being somewhere and trying to get home. What are you saying? Judith set the letter down and looked at her sister directly. I'm saying that anyone who knew Thomas could have written this. Someone from his unit who survived, maybe someone who wanted to give you hope, or… She hesitated. Or what? Or someone who's not well-intentioned at all. Someone who preys on grieving women, who knows what the telegrams say and what families are desperate to hear. Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest. You think this is a con? That someone is trying to scam me? I think it's a possibility we need to consider. There have been reports in the papers, people taking advantage of war widows, promising to deliver messages from the dead, asking for money in exchange for more information. No one has asked me for money. Not yet. The sisters stared at each other across the guest room, the afternoon light making shadows on the wallpaper. Finally, Judith's expression softened. Ellie, I know how much you love Thomas. I know how much you still love him. But I don't want to see you hurt worse than you already are. If this letter is real, if Thomas somehow survived and found a way to write to you, then that's a miracle. But if it's not… She didn't finish the sentence. I asked for a sign, Eleanor said quietly. I prayed for a sign that he was still alive, and this letter arrived. That's not a coincidence. Prayer doesn't work like a telegram service, Ellie. God doesn't send certified mail. Maybe he does. Maybe this is exactly how he works. Judith sighed and sat down on the bed. All right. Let's say this letter is really from Thomas. Let's say he's alive somewhere and managed to get this to you. What does that mean? What do you do with this information? Eleanor hadn't thought that far ahead. The letter existed in her mind as proof of hope, but Judith's question forced her to confront the practical implications. If Thomas was alive, why hadn't he contacted the military? Why the cryptic message? Why the strange paper and the missing postmark? I keep praying, Eleanor said finally. I keep doing what the letter asks. I keep saying his name. I keep believing, and if another letter comes, then I'll know I was right. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. Chapter 7. The Weight of Numbers During World War II. The United States Army's Graves Registration Service was responsible for identifying and recovering the remains of American servicemen killed in action. Between 1941 and 1945, they processed approximately 280,000 bodies across all theaters of war. Of these, roughly 78,000 were initially buried in temporary military cemeteries overseas, with plans to repatriate them after the war. However, due to the chaos of combat, approximately 26,000 American servicemen were classified as missing in action. With no recoverable remains, their bodies lost to ocean depths, destroyed by explosions, or simply vanished in the fog of war. The margin of identification error was estimated at 3%. Meaning that approximately 8,400 bodies were potentially misidentified, buried under the wrong names, or confused with other casualties in the massive logistical operation of wartime death. For families waiting at home, these numbers translated into agonizing uncertainty. Missing in action could mean anything. Captured, hiding, injured and unable to communicate, or dead in a way that left no evidence. The military offered no timeline for resolution. Some families waited months, others waited years. A small percentage would wait for decades, receiving notification of identified remains well into the 1980s and beyond. Eleanor kept these statistics in a notebook she'd started maintaining after the second letter arrived. She'd gone to the library and requested every book, every article, every military document about Mia soldiers and recovery operations. She'd copied numbers into her careful handwriting, creating columns and categories, trying to build a framework of possibility around her hope. In her notebook, Thomas became data point, one husband among 26,000 missing. One man in a statistical universe of uncertainty. But the letters kept coming, and they refused to conform to statistics. Chapter 8. The Pattern Emerges. The second letter arrived on April 3, 1945, exactly 4 weeks after the first. This time Eleanor was waiting. She'd been checking the mail with an intensity that bordered on obsession, standing at the window every afternoon waiting for the postman. When she saw him place an envelope in her mailbox, she ran outside without putting on shoes, ignoring the cold April rain. The envelope was identical to the first. No return address, smudged postmark, thick waxy paper. Inside, Thomas's handwriting covered a single page. My dearest Ellie, thank you for not giving up. I felt you speaking my name last Tuesday during the prayer circle. It came through like a lifeline, pulling me closer to home. I'm making progress, though it's slow. There are others here with me, other men who got lost the same way I did. Some of them have been here much longer. Some of them have started to forget why they need to leave. I need you to do something for me. On the first Sunday of May, I need you to go to the church at midnight. Stand in the sanctuary and call my name 3 times. I know it sounds strange, but trust me, it's important. The veil is thinner at midnight, especially in holy places. Your voice will carry farther. I'm so close, Ellie. I can almost see the house we plan to build. Don't give up on me now. All my love. Thomas. Eleanor read the letter sitting on her front steps in the rain, water soaking through her dress. When Judith found her 10 minutes later, she was crying, though whether from joy or fear she couldn't say. Another one? Judith asked, sitting down beside her. Eleanor nodded, handing her the letter. Judith read it quickly, her expression darkening. Ellie, this is asking you to do something. This is asking you to go to the church at midnight and perform what sounds like a ritual. He's asking me to call his name. That's not a ritual, it's occult behavior. Standing in a church at midnight, speaking someone's name 3 times? That's not Christian prayer, Ellie. That's something else entirely. I don't care what it is. If it helps Thomas find his way home, what if Thomas didn't write this? Judith's voice was sharp now. What if someone is manipulating you, leading you toward something dangerous? He read it twice, his expression grave. Eleanor, this is escalating. First, it was just receiving letters, then performing a midnight vigil, and now burning objects at a specific location. This feels less like spiritual communication and more like something else. Like what? Like someone testing how far you'll go. Like someone establishing control. He set the letter down. I'm going with you. If you insist on doing this, I'm coming along as a witness. Eleanor wanted to refuse. This felt private, sacred, something between her and Thomas alone. But she also recognized the wisdom in having someone present, someone who could confirm what happened or didn't happen. All right, she agreed. June 15th at sunset, Chapter 12. The Clearing by Miller's Creek. The willow trees by Miller's Creek had been their secret place during the brief months between their wedding and Thomas' deployment. They discovered it on a Sunday drive in November, a clearing accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through private farmland. The farmer, old Mr. Holloway, had given them permission to walk his property, and they'd spent hours there planning their future house, how many bedrooms where the kitchen would face, how they'd build a porch, where they could watch the sunset together. Those napkin blueprints, stained with coffee rings and marked with their enthusiastic scribbles, had lived in Eleanor's hope chest for 3 years. She retrieved them on the morning of June 15th, handling the fragile paper with reverence. Looking at them now, she could almost hear Thomas's voice. 2 stories, Ellie. We need room for at least 3 kids, maybe 4. They'd never discussed whether they wanted children. It had been assumed as natural as breathing. But now, holding these napkins, Eleanor realized they represented a life that existed only in potential. A future that had been stolen by war and circumstance and whatever inexplicable thing had happened to her husband in France. Reverend Michaels picked her up at 6:45 p.m. They drove in silence to the edge of Holloway's farm, then walked the familiar path through the woods. The evening was warm, humid, with fireflies beginning their nightly dance among the trees. Eleanor carried the napkins in an envelope, along with matches. The clearing looked exactly as she remembered. The ring of willows, the gentle curve of the creek, the flat space where they'd imagined their house would stand. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. This is the place? Reverend Michaels asked. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Being here without Thomas felt like a desecration. They walked to the edge of the creek. Eleanor took out the napkins, spreading them on the ground so she could see them one last time. The crude drawings of rooms and walls and windows, the calculations of square footage, Thomas's handwriting next to her own. Are you certain you want to do this? The Reverend asked softly. No, but I'm going to anyway. She struck a match and touched it to the first napkin. The paper caught quickly, flames consuming their dreams in seconds. She lit the second, then the third, watching as their blueprint house burned in her hands. When only ashes remained, She walked to the water's edge and released them into the creek, watching them swirl away in the current. The sun touched the horizon. Eleanor and Reverend Michael stood waiting, though for what neither could say. Minutes passed. The sun sank lower. Birds called from the trees. The creek burbled over stones. Everything was ordinary, unremarkable, disappointingly normal. Perhaps that's all it needed to be, Reverend Michael said gently. A ritual of letting go. A way of releasing the future you'd planned so you can begin building a new one. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. I thought he'd be here. I thought burning the blueprints would summon him somehow, or prove he was still alive. Or, her voice broke. The Reverend put a hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. They turned to leave. Eleanor took 3 steps toward the path, then heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it, a voice carrying across the clearing. Ellie. She spun around. Did you hear that? Reverend Michael's face had gone white. Yes, I heard it. Ellie, I'm here. The voice was coming from the center of the clearing, from the exact spot where they'd planned to build their house. Eleanor ran toward it, her heart pounding, and stopped in the middle of the flat space. Nothing. No one. Just empty air and lengthening shadows. Thomas? She called. Thomas, where are you? I'm here. I've always been here. Look down, Ellie. Look at your feet. Eleanor looked down at the ground beneath her. At first she saw nothing unusual, just dirt and grass and scattered wildflowers. Then her eyes adjusted, and she realized she was seeing something else. Rectangular depressions in the earth, arranged in a pattern that matched their napkin blueprint exactly. Foundation marks. Old ones, half filled with soil and overgrown with vegetation, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. There was a house here, she whispered. There was already a house here. Reverend Michaels knelt down, examining the ground. You're right. These are foundation stones, probably from the 1800s. The house must have burned or been torn down decades ago. We never knew, Eleanor said, her voice hollow. We thought we were planning something new, but we were just tracing something that already existed. Ellie, the voice again, fainter now. I'm not coming home. I was never coming home. But I needed you to know that the house was real. That the life we wanted was real, even if it couldn't be ours. Build it again, Ellie, not for me. For yourself. Thomas, please. But the voice was gone. Eleanor stood in the ruins of a house that had been built long before she was born. In the clearing where she dreamed of building a house with a man who would never return, and felt the weight of understanding settle over her like a shroud. Chapter 13. The investigation begins. Eleanor didn't receive another letter for 6 weeks. During that time she fell into a depression so deep that concerned neighbors began leaving casseroles on her doorstep. She went to work mechanically, came home to an empty house, and spent her evenings sitting at the kitchen table staring at Thomas's photograph. Judith called twice a week, begging her to come to Chicago, to get away from the town and the memories and whatever was happening to her. I can't leave, Eleanor told her. Not until I know. Know what, Ellie, he's gone. The military said he's missing, and missing means, don't say it. In late July, Eleanor made a decision. If she couldn't find Thomas, she would find the truth about the letters. She would investigate them the way a detective would, systematically and rationally, until she understood their origin. She started with the physical evidence. She took the 4 letters to Dr. Raymond Kepler, a chemistry professor at the local college who owed her late father a favor. Dr. Kepler examined the paper under a microscope and ran several tests. This is interesting, he said, showing her the results. The paper is a cotton-linen blend, consistent with wartime European production. The ink is standard military issue. But this residue you mentioned, the gray powder, that's volcanic ash. Specifically, ash consistent with the 1943 eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius? In Italy? Yes, there was a major eruption in March 1943 that disrupted Allied operations in the region. Ash from that eruption was carried by wind patterns across much of southern Europe. If your husband was anywhere in that region at the time, his possessions, papers, and clothing would have been exposed to it. Eleanor's heart raced. But Thomas was reported missing in France, not Italy. Military records aren't always accurate, especially in the confusion of active combat. Units get reassigned, soldiers get transferred. It's possible your husband served in Italy before France, or that these letters were written by someone who did. The second piece of evidence was the handwriting. Eleanor took samples of Thomas's letters, both the ones from before he went missing and the strange Ones that arrived after to a graphologist in the city, a woman named Dr. Iris Chen, who worked with law enforcement on fraud cases. Dr. Chen's analysis took 3 days. When Eleanor returned to collect the results, the graphologist's expression was troubled. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've examined both sets of letters carefully. The handwriting is consistent, same letter formations, same pressure patterns, same idiosyncratic features. By every technical measure, these were all written by the same person. But there's something anomalous about the later letters. The stroke order is correct, the muscle memory is correct, but there's a hesitation in the writing that suggests either extreme fatigue, injury to the writing hand, or," she paused. "Or what? Or someone copying from a reference while trying to maintain the natural flow of the original writer. It's subtle, almost undetectable, but it's there. Like someone who learned to forge a signature by practicing it hundreds of times until they could reproduce it flawlessly. But they were still consciously thinking about each stroke rather than writing naturally." Eleanor left the graphologist's office with more questions than answers. The paper was real, from Europe, from the right time period. The handwriting was Thomas's, or an impossibly perfect imitation. The content was specific, personal, something only Thomas would know. But the voice in the clearing had said, "I'm not coming home. I was never coming home." Chapter 14. The Scale of Loss. The United States military casualty statistics for World War II paint a stark picture of the war's human cost. Of the 16,112,566 Americans who served in uniform, 405,399 were killed in action. An additional 670,846 were wounded, but survived. However, these numbers don't capture the full scope of loss. 30,314 American servicemen were captured and died in POW camps. 14,059 died in non-combat accidents. And 26,000 were officially declared missing in action with no remains ever recovered. The psychological toll was equally staggering but harder to quantify. An estimated 1.4 million American veterans returned home with what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock, conditions we now recognize as PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and severe depression. Approximately 504,000 veterans were hospitalized for psychiatric conditions between 1945 and 1947. The divorce rate among returning veterans was 27% higher than the general population. Suicide rates among combat veterans were elevated for decades after the war's end. For the families left behind, the wives, parents, and children of the missing, the absence of closure created a unique form of grief that psychologists would later term ambiguous loss. Studies conducted in the 1950s found that widows of confirmed dead servicemen adjusted better psychologically than wives of MIA soldiers, despite the pain of certain loss. The latter group reported higher rates of depression, anxiety, and what researchers called perpetual waiting syndrome, an inability to move forward with life while holding on to hope for a return that grew less likely with each passing year. Eleanor Hartwell, sitting in the library with these statistics spread before her, realized she was part of a vast invisible community, women suspended between hope and despair, waiting for answers that might never come. Chapter 15. The Veteran Who Knew. In August 1945, as the war in the Pacific reached its apocalyptic conclusion with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a man named Robert Faulkner appeared at Eleanor's door. He was in his early 30s, gaunt and tired-looking, wearing a civilian suit that hung loose on his frame. One of his hands was wrapped in bandages. "Mrs. Hartwell?" he asked. "Mrs. Thomas Hartwell?" "Yes, can I help you? My name is Robert Faulkner. I served in the same unit as your husband. I was with him at the end. May I come in?" Eleanor's hands started shaking. She stepped aside, letting him enter. They sat in the living room. Faulkner refused her offer of coffee but accepted a glass of water, which he drank slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. "I need to tell you about December 20th, 1944, he began. "The day Thomas disappeared. We were part of a reconnaissance unit in the Ardennes forest, what they recalling the Battle of the Bulge now. Our squad got separated during a German counterattack. 12 of us ended up pinned down in the ruins of a farmhouse, surrounded, no radio contact." Eleanor leaned forward. "What happened?" "We held out for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Thomas volunteered to make a run for Allied lines to bring back help. It was a suicide mission, really. The Germans had the area locked down tight. But we were out of ammunition, out of food, and 3 men were wounded badly. Someone had to try. And Thomas made it about 200 yards before German fire caught him. I saw him go down. The rest of us surrendered an hour later. Faulkner's voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts. I spent the next 4 months in a POW camp. Got liberated in April. Been trying to track down families of the men who didn't make it ever since. Eleanor felt the room spinning. You saw him die? I saw him fall. In war, that usually means the same thing. Faulkner unwrapped his bandaged hand, revealing scar tissue from severe burns. I got this trying to pull one of our wounded out of a burning building. Thomas got whatever got him trying to save all of us. He was a hero, Mrs. Hartwell. I wanted you to know that. But the military said he was missing. Not killed. Missing in action is what they say when there's no body to recover. The area where Thomas fell was under German control for weeks afterward. By the time Allied forces retook that ground, there was nothing left to find. Snow, artillery fire, scavenging animals. War doesn't leave much behind. Eleanor pulled out the letters from her pocket. Then how do you explain these? She handed them to Faulkner. He read through all 4 carefully, his expression growing increasingly confused. I don't understand. These are written like he's still alive somewhere, like he's trying to get home. And? They arrived after the telegram. After he was declared missing. The handwriting is his. I've had it analyzed. Faulkner looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes. Pity mixed with concern. Mrs. Hartwell, I don't know who wrote these letters, but it wasn't Thomas. Thomas Hartwell died on December 20th, 1944 in France. I'm sorry. I truly am. But that's the truth. After Faulkner left, Eleanor sat alone in her living room for hours, holding the letters and trying to reconcile 2 irreconcilable realities. A man who'd been there, who'd witnessed Thomas's death, and letters written in Thomas's hand that arrived months later. One of them had to be lying, but which one and why? Chapter 16. The Postmaster's Secret. Mrs. Patterson, the postmaster, had worked at the 3rd Street Post Office for 23 years. She was a fixture of the town, a woman who knew everyone's business because she handled everyone's mail. Eleanor had always found her friendly if a bit nosy. The kind of woman who would comment on how many letters you were receiving or sending, always with a smile but also with sharp eyes that missed nothing. 3 days after Robert Faulkner's visit, Eleanor went to the post office with a specific purpose. She waited until the lunch rush was over, and Mrs. Patterson was alone at the counter. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you about the letters I've been receiving. The postmaster's smile faltered slightly. What letters, dear? The ones from my husband. The ones with no return address and smudged postmarks. Mrs. Patterson busied herself with sorting papers. I deliver hundreds of letters a day, Eleanor. I can't remember every. Please. Eleanor's voice was firm. I know you remember. You've been giving me odd looks every time I come in. You've handled these letters. I need to know what you know. Mrs. Patterson stopped sorting. She looked around the empty post office, then beckoned Eleanor toward the back room. Come with me. There's something you should see. They went into the sorting room, where bags of mail were organized by destination. Mrs. Patterson pulled a key from her pocket and opened a locked drawer in her desk. Inside were 4 envelopes, identical to the ones Eleanor had received. These arrived yesterday, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. I didn't deliver them. I've been holding them back. Eleanor stared at the envelopes. They were addressed to 4 different women in town. Mrs. Margaret Donnelly, Mrs. Ruth Kimball, Mrs. Catherine Price, and Mrs. Helen Morrison, all members of the prayer circle. All with husbands or sons missing or killed in action. Open them, Eleanor said. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then slit open the first envelope with her letter opener. Inside was a single page, handwriting that Eleanor didn't recognize. Mrs. Patterson read it aloud. My dearest Margaret, I know you must have received the telegram by now. I know what it said, and I know what you must think. But I'm writing to tell you that I'm still here. It was the same letter Eleanor had received. Word for word. Only the name was different. They opened the others. All identical. All promising return, all asking for vigils and rituals and acts of faith. Eleanor felt cold spreading through her chest. Someone is sending these to all of us. Someone is targeting grieving women. But how did they get the handwriting right? Mrs. Patterson asked. Margaret showed me a letter from her son last month. I'd swear this is his handwriting. Eleanor thought about Dr. Chun's analysis. Someone copying from a reference with extreme precision. Where do these letters come from? What's the actual origin point? Mrs. Patterson examined the postmarks on all 4 letters with a magnifying glass. They're deliberately obscured, but I can make out part of this one. It looks like Riverside. There's a veterans hospital in Riverside, about 60 miles from here. A hospital? For wounded soldiers. They've been bringing them back all year, the ones too injured to return to civilian life immediately. Physical wounds, mental wounds. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped. Some of them aren't quite right anymore, Eleanor. The war broke something inside them. Eleanor gathered the 4 letters. I need to go there. I need to find out who's doing this and why. Be careful, Mrs. Patterson warned. Whoever this is, they know intimate details about deceased servicemen. They know what to say to make desperate women believe. That's not just cruel, that's calculated. Eleanor left the post office with the letters and a growing sense of dread. The pieces were assembling into a picture she didn't want to see, a truth that was somehow worse than her husband being dead. Chapter 17. Riverside Veterans Hospital. The Riverside Veterans Hospital was a sprawling brick complex that had been converted from a tuberculosis sanatorium to handle the flood of wounded returning from Europe and the Pacific. Eleanor took a bus there on a Wednesday morning in late August, carrying photocopies of the letters and Thomas's photograph. The building loomed against a gray sky, 3 stories of institutional architecture surrounded by manicured lawns where men in wheelchairs sat smoking cigarettes, their eyes distant. At the front desk, she asked to speak with the administrator. After 20 minutes of waiting, a tired-looking woman in her 50s appeared. I'm Mrs. Delacroix, the administrative director. How can I help you? Eleanor showed her the letters. These are being sent to multiple women in my town, all with relatives killed or missing in the war. The postmarks trace back here. I need to know who's sending them. Mrs. Delacroix examined the letters with a deepening frown. This is disturbing, but I can assure you our patients don't have unsupervised access to the postal system. All outgoing mail is screened. Could someone be bypassing that screening? It's possible, but unlikely. Let me check our records. She disappeared into a back office. Eleanor waited in the sterile lobby, watching orderlies push medication carts down hallways, listening to distant voices and occasional screams from the upper floors. This was where broken soldiers came to be reassembled, she thought. Or at least to be kept from harming themselves and others. Mrs. Delacroix returned 15 minutes later, her expression troubled. I found something in our files. We have a patient in the psychiatric ward, admitted in March of this year. He was found wandering in a train station, suffering from severe dissociative amnesia. No identification, no dog tags, couldn't tell us his name or unit. But he had a notebook with him, filled with names and addresses. What kind of names? Dead soldiers. Dozens of them. With their hometowns, their wives' names, their children's names. Like he'd been collecting information about casualties. Eleanor's mouth went dry. Can I see him? That's irregular. He's not authorized for visitors. Please. My husband is one of the names in that notebook, isn't he? Mrs. Delacroix hesitated, then nodded. Thomas Hartwell. Your husband's name is there, along with your address. But Mrs. Hartwell, you need to understand this patient is not well. He believes he's multiple people. He claims to be carrying the identities of soldiers who died, says he's trying to help them send final messages to their families. It's a delusion brought on by trauma. I still need to see him. They walked through locked doors and upstairs, deeper into the hospital's psychiatric wing. The walls were painted institution green. Everything smelled of disinfectant and despair. Finally, they reached a room with a small window in the door. He's in there, Mrs. Delacroix said. We call him Patient 7 because he won't tell us his real name. 15 minutes, and I'll be right outside. Eleanor looked through the window. Inside was a man sitting at a small table, writing in a notebook. He was thin, with shaggy dark hair and a beard. His left hand was bandaged. The same bandaged hand she'd seen on Robert Faulkner. Lanner's breath caught. Let me in. Mrs. Delacroix unlocked the door. Eleanor stepped inside. The man looked up as she saw his eyes haunted, fractured, containing multitudes. When he spoke, his voice shifted between different accents, different cadences, as if multiple people were speaking through one mouth. Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor, I knew you'd come eventually. Thomas said you would. They all said their wives would figure it out. Eleanor approached slowly. Who are you? I'm everyone who didn't make it home. I'm the collection of last words that never got spoken. I'm Patient 7, and I'm Robert Faulkner, and I'm Thomas Hartwell, and I'm 37 others whose names I carry like stones. He smiled, and it was the saddest expression Eleanor had ever seen. I was there when they died, you see. Every single one of them. I held them. or I dragged them, or I closed their eyes. And they asked me to remember them, to tell their families, to finish their stories. But you're writing fake letters. You're giving false hope, am I? He held up his bandaged hand. I got these burns pulling a man from a burning tank. Want to know his name? Robert Faulkner. He died 3 hours later, but before he did, he made me promise to tell his mother he wasn't afraid. So I became Robert Faulkner long enough to deliver that message. Then I became Thomas Hartwell long enough to tell you he's not coming home, but the house you planned was real. Then I became David Donnelly and James Kimball and Peter Price. I become whoever needs to send one last message. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. But the letters aren't true. Thomas isn't alive somewhere trying to get home. Isn't he? Patient 7's eyes held hers. Every letter I write, I channel their voices. I hold their dog tags. He pulled a chain from under his shirt, heavy with dozens of tags. And I let them speak through me. Maybe that's madness. Probably that's madness. But when I write in Thomas Hartwell's hand, I am Thomas Hartwell. I carry his love for you. I carry his regret. I carry his last thoughts. Is that so different from being alive? Yes, Eleanor whispered. It's completely different. Then why did you perform the midnight vigil? Why did you burn the blueprints? Because some part of you knew that the letters weren't about Thomas being physically alive. They were about his memory being alive, about the love that doesn't die just because the body does. Eleanor sank into the chair across from him. You're insane. Yes, Patient 7 agreed, but I'm also right. The men who died are gone. But their stories, their love, their final words, those need to be delivered. The military sends telegrams. I send something more. Something that helps you process the grief, that gives you rituals to perform, that lets you say goodbye properly. Is that cruel? Or is that the kindest thing a broken soldier can do with the pieces he left with? They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Eleanor asked, what really happened to Thomas? Patient 7 closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, steadier, more focused. It sounded eerily like Thomas. We were pinned down in the Ardennes. I volunteered to make a run for help. I made it about 200 yards before German fire caught me. I died quickly, Eleanor. I wasn't alone. Robert Faulkner was there, and he stayed with me until the end. I asked him to tell you I loved you. I asked him to tell you to build the house anyway, even without me. But Robert died in the POW camp. So now this man, whoever he really is, carries both our messages. All of our messages. Eleanor was openly crying now. How do I know any of this is real? How do I know you're not just reading from reports and making up details? You don't, Patient 7 said simply. That's the nature of faith. But answer me this. Did the letters help? Did the rituals give you something the telegram couldn't? Did speaking Thomas's name in the dark church make you feel connected to him in a way that just grieving alone didn't? Eleanor thought about the midnight vigil, the moment when she'd heard Thomas's voice thank her. The burning of the blueprints, the release she'd felt letting go of that particular future. The way the letters had given structure to her grief, had transformed it from a shapeless ache into something she could interact with, respond to, eventually move beyond. Yes, she admitted. They helped. Then maybe that's enough. Maybe the truth of whether I am channeling the dead or just a very committed fraud doesn't matter as much as the fact that you got to say goodbye, that you got to perform rituals of closure, that you got to believe, for a little while, that love continues past death. Eleanor stood up. I should report you. What I'm doing is carrying messages from the dead, Patient 7 interrupted. And I'll keep doing it until I run out of names, or until they lock me in a room with padded walls. Whichever comes first. You can report me if you want. But consider this. How many other women are waiting for letters that will never come? How many other families need to hear that their sons, their husbands, their brothers, that they were loved, that they were remembered, that their last thoughts were of home? Eleanor left the room without answering. Chapter 18. The choice Eleanor makes. Eleanor returned home that evening and sat at her kitchen table with all of Thomas's letters spread before her, the real ones from before he went missing, and the false ones that had arrived after. She had a choice to make. She could go to the authorities. Report Patient 7. Have him prosecuted for fraud, for impersonating servicemen, for exploiting grieving widows. She had evidence. The letters, Mrs. Patterson's testimony, the hospital records. It would be a clear case. Or she could remain silent. The letters to the other women, Margaret, Ruth, Catherine, Helen, were still being held by Mrs. Patterson, Eleanor could tell her to destroy them, to report patient 7 to protect the other women from his psychological manipulation. Or she could tell Mrs. Patterson to deliver them. Eleanor thought about what Reverend Michaels had said, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. She thought about the voice in the clearing that had said, "Build it again, Ellie. Not for me. For yourself." She thought about the midnight vigil and the moment when she'd almost seen Thomas, translucent and desperate and loving. Had that been real? Had patient 7 somehow channeled her dead husband's spirit through sympathetic magic and psychological manipulation? Or had it all been her own grief manifesting as vision and voice, her subconscious finding ways to process trauma through ritual? She realized the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd said goodbye. What mattered was that she'd released the future she'd planned with Thomas, and had begun, however slowly, to imagine a different future. What mattered was that the letters, fake or channeled or whatever they were, had given her a framework for grief that the stark finality of the telegram hadn't. The next morning, Eleanor went to see Mrs. Patterson. "Deliver the letters," she said. "But Eleanor, you know they're not real." "Do I? Do we really know what's real when it comes to the dead and the grieving? Those women are where I was 4 months ago, suspended between hope and despair, unable to move forward. The letters will give them rituals. They'll give them ways to say goodbye. And maybe that's not honest, but maybe it's kind. What about the man who's writing them? He's a soldier who broke in a way we can't fix, who's trying to complete missions that can never be completed. Let him keep trying. When he runs out of names, maybe he'll find peace. Until then," Eleanor paused. "Until then, let him be a bridge between the dead and the living. Even if that bridge is built from delusion and grief." Mrs. Patterson studied her face. "You've changed, Eleanor. You're harder now?" "No, I'm realistic. War doesn't leave room for easy answers. We do what we can with the pieces we're left with." The letters were delivered. Over the next 3 months, Eleanor watched as the other women in the prayer circle went through their own journeys. Margaret Donnelly performed a midnight vigil in her son's old bedroom, speaking his name 3 times and reporting that she felt his presence one last time before he passed on. Ruth Kimball burned letters her husband had sent from Italy and scattered the ashes in her garden, saying she was planting memories to grow into something new. Catherine Price went to the ocean where her brother's plane had gone down and released a bottle with his photograph, watching it drift away on the tide. Were they being manipulated? Yes. Were they being helped? Also yes. The two truths coexisted, uncomfortable and undeniable. Epilogue. What was built 3 years later, in the spring of 1948, Eleanor stood in the clearing by Miller's Creek watching the last wall of her house go up. It wasn't the house she and Thomas had drawn on those napkins. It was smaller, more practical, designed for one person rather than a family. But it stood on the same foundation stones they'd found that sunset evening, the ruins of something that had come before. The contractor, a veteran named James who'd lost his left leg in the Pacific, hammered the final nail into place and stepped back. "That's it, Mrs. Hartwell. You're officially a homeowner," Eleanor smiled. "Thank you." "James, it's perfect." She de-used money from Thomas's military death benefit. They finally declared him killed in action in 1946 after 18 months of missing status. She'd also used savings from her factory work and a small inheritance from her grandmother. The house had taken a year to build, working slowly and carefully, getting every detail right. Inside, she'd hung the photograph of Thomas in his uniform, smiling next to the Jeep. Beside it was the last letter from patient 7, which had arrived in June 1946. "My dear Sally, this is the last letter I'll write. I've delivered all the messages I was carrying, and it's time for me to find my own rest. Thank you for understanding what I was trying to do. Thank you for letting me be Thomas long enough to tell you what he wanted you to know. That love doesn't end, it just changes form. Build the house, live the life, be happy. That's what all of us wanted for the people we left behind. All my love theirs and mine, the man who carried 38 names, Eleanor, never learned patient 7's real identity. The hospital reported in 1947 that he'd been transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility, and she'd decided not to pursue it further. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. Some bridges between worlds needed to be burned once you'd crossed them. She furnished her house simply: a bed, a table, chairs, bookshelves. She got a cat named Vesuvius in honor of the volcanic ash that had been the first clue in her investigation. She planted a garden. She invited her sister Judith to visit, and they reconciled over coffee on the new porch. "Are you happy?" Judith asked during that first visit. Eleanor considered the question. "I'm at peace. That's close enough." She never remarried. She'd had offers. There were more women than men after the war, and an independent woman with her own house was something of a rarity. But she found she didn't need partnership the way she once had. The letters, real and false, channeled and imagined, had taught her that love could exist without physical presence, that connection could transcend life.